Good. Boy. So, when Mark Lazar, I'm presenting on transparency, compliance, consent, and trust. We have a lot of big problems, and age assurance is definitely the key part of solving them. But there's bigger problems with transparency, compliance, consent, and trust overall. And this presentation aims to aim at a bigger solution. So, yes, keep going. Highlights and stuff. Let's see. Slide. So part one, so I've got three parts of this presentation where we sort of go through age assurance with some risks, digitally and physically, and then we continue on to look at a different solution, a different approach to digital identity management. Smaller. So I guess to start off with, economy obviously is a great way to look at some of the harder problems. Yeah, so there I think that kind of sums up a lot of the issues we're having where kids are online and they're seeing a lot of stuff that we don't even know about, and they like to do more than copy what we see. And I think a lot of it is just it's black box. There's not a lot of transparency around what's going on online. So I guess a little bit about me is that my background is I've got a degree in criminology law, criminal justice policy. I came to London, did a postgrad and master's in social research, studying CCTV surveillance, and did a lot of work on measuring the transparency and compliance of CCTV signs and if they're usable and how long it takes to use them and how hard it is to use them. And we found that compliance and the ability to use these signs actually dropped through this longitudinal study that we were doing. And now, I guess, we're finding that, there's some significant issues with governance in that 15 years after this large rollout of CCTV in the UK, there's actually a spike in knife crimes. And it turns out if you put a CCTV camera in the middle of a park, the adults go away from the CCTV camera and the kids are more or less ungoverned in those spaces. And it makes them, more insecure. So what we found is that there's like 9,000 knife crimes in 2015, but in 2020 there's 14,000, like almost 15,000. There's a significant increase, 54%. But you can see that during the pandemic, there's actually a drop in knife crime because the kids are at home being governed. You would expect, but last year was the highest on record for death by knife crime for kids. So, the unintended consequences of displacing governance with surveillance might not be apparent up front. And I think the reason is that CCTV, we found that it made it a lot easier to find criminals when they did something wrong, but not so much as protect, stop, or prevent crime. But that's arguable, I think. But that's not really the point. I think the aim is that displacing governance has unintended consequences. So I got on the way here. There's an Evening Standard article. It showed that young Londoners report the lowest level of being safe. No child in London should be dying and fearing death on the way to school, and children and those who love them seem to be walking different streets to others in London. So there is a lot of assurance issues with the amount of money that's being spent in CCTV and the impact it might actually be having on the intended impact was to make children more safe. So similarly, online, we're having the same sort of situation. Oops. There's a lot of security risks to browsing. Typically, a child will want to go to a website right now. Relying parties, we call them PII controllers or data controllers. So they have, how old are you? The child says, I'm 19. And then they get access to the site, and while they're being accessed, they have cookies and pixels which are without consent, so their data is being scraped, and it's being sent to all these other parties, and they're getting into these platforms online, and this is how they're being tracked. And there's a lot of privacy risk with that. So there's a lot of profiling with identities, cookie data. There's a lot of data leaks because there's a lot of parties involved. And again, I mean, we're passing our data out over and over again. In 2021, there's 79 zettabytes of data, and it's estimated 90% of that data is replicated data, which really exposes our information to many more security risks like phishing and ID spoofing and all the like. But on the relying party side of the controller, they're now subject to fines under the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. I'm not sure how much that applies in the UK. So
they don't, but then there's data protection GDPR, that's fines too.
They're still in there. So I think that's just those are ways in which the European Union is looking at how to better enforce and tackle these issues, because they've been trying to solve this for a long time. So the consent receipt, which we worked on, was actually originally in the Digital Services Act, was not yet standard. So it makes it really difficult for regulators to audit and impossible in some cases, and enforcement is extremely slow and analog. So people end up not being able to express the service because there's no scope of disclosure. So there's really a lack of transparency. And the Digital Services Act prohibits the use of targeted advertising based on the use of minors, personal data, and also dark patterns. So arguably the I agree checkbox or to privacy policy is a dark pattern because people don't actually know what they're agreeing to. So as with CCTV, the human governance is displaced. There's no such thing as a necessary cookie, but they've convinced us that there is one, and they put these things on devices without people's consent or permission. And it's like the equivalent to letting an advertising company into your house to put a CCTV in your house, by placing a record in your device. So a cookie really is a digital receipt, and we kind of saw this problem a long time ago when we started working on standardizing a transparency record receipt framework, which last year became standard ISO 27560 was published, and that took about 10 years. And all of that work was to actually address these problems and enable people with their own records so that they can authenticate themselves. So there's a lot of privacy risks to browsing as well in this scenario. The profiles enable stalking-based advertising, misinformation, and manipulation. A lot of gaslighting, grooming, and phishing, which is causing a lot of problems and making people more and more insecure. Just like perhaps CCTV, the digital identity and security technology, it might be making services more secure, but it's making people less secure. And for controllers, with the laws coming into force, Article 14, the controller identity should be presented up front, and you don't actually see who the controller is when you access the service, so you can't actually know who's taking your data before you give it. So there's a fundamental flaw just in this paradigm with what we're seeing online. People don't get a record of processing activity, or there isn't one, so it doesn't comply with Article 30. And with Convention 108, Article 80, for transfers of data, there should be a log that a regulator should be able to see. So currently in this system, there's actually no evidence of consent or proof of notice, and there's really no way for people to actually trust to see who's processing their data. So that's the current environment. So one of the hats I do have on, first of all, I forgot to mention, I am here as part of the Workgroup 5 ISO committee expert representing Canada, and I'm also a Cantera co-chair and editor, but I am not presenting with those hats on right now, so this is not either of those organizations' opinions, and not a program that they are running, although I do collaborate with some of us with them. So on that note, we have been working on a transparency performance scheme assessment at Cantera, which enables to create these records by first looking at the timing of notice to see if there's a notification of the controller, at what point before, just in time, at the time level after data collection, So it can automatically flag it as not compliant for consent, because if you don't know who you're giving your data to, it's not possible to call that consent. So right away, that's like the easiest way we could show, oh, look, it's not compliant. The controller identity information, how complete it is. If it's not complete, it's actually not operational in context for people to use their rights. So a lot of times you have to use analog privacy processes. And then how accessible that information is it right on the screen, or do you have to scroll or the link? If so, it's not accessible in context. And then examining the SSL certificate to see if the OU organization matches the controller, and if it's in another jurisdiction or the jurisdiction you expect it to be, because then oftentimes our data is being sent to another country and we have no way of knowing, and it's part of the security framework that's doing that. So as we do this assessment, it creates a controller controller record, and it uses the ISO 29100 series, 29114 and 27560, which is the consent record information structure, to which the came from the consent receipt. So this is the standard schema that can be used, and it's authoritative over what you might be seeing as a controller record or any identity out there. So effectively, as these laws come into force and a data controller is specified and required as information, that's now the identity that we think is authoritative going forward. So what is real consent? I'm Canadian, so we have lots of opinions on that, but we think that it's really about being polite, etiquette, asking for permission before doing something, getting someone's consent. So humans manage consent and systems manage permission, and that's really clear. So when you have a button, give us your consent online, we're really saying, give us permission because you've consented to come here in the first place, right? So it's a dark pattern if you see a consent button online, and it's really misleading to people. So if we extend the consent, the controller record with the purpose specification, which is really at the heart of what we standardize, then you have a consent or a notice receipt. And fundamentally, the European Data Protection Board is really clear about what consent should be legally, and I think this comes from the Article 7 and Article 8, which specify that people should have the choice of controlling their own information. So, there's a big, contextual issue with, privacy being sort of analog and the use of our records and our data being digital. So this, brings that to parity. So if Canada made the internet, all services would be very polite. Consent etiquette would be reaffirmed with every notice you read. You would only need to read it once. Online consent would naturally be respected in this way, and it would be implied at the browser level. So we think the browser is liable for all of the websites that don't have notice, and the risk should be before you get to the website according to the law. And we don't think that's a problem because they actually have these security notices that you see all the time that stop you going from a website saying there might be a security problem. Well, there's definitely a privacy problem, right? We know there's a lot of collusion. I was involved in the Do Not Track work with W3C a while ago, trying to work with the industry, and we all know how that worked out. So, we look at frameworks and how a digital wallet or a browser could collect records or receipts independently of the service provider. Now we can use those to manage our rights independently of the services. And in this way, we think you mitigate liability and risk because the notice passes the risk back to the individual because they can actually make a choice to secure themselves. And then you pass it back to the service provider when you withdraw your consent or say object to processing. So that is the end of the second part. I was going to take some questions and that sort of thing here if there were many, but I'm happy to just run forward into what we really want to get to, which is the solution that we've been working on for quite a while. So let's go forward. So what we're talking about here is digital privacy transparency. It's a notarial infrastructure. So the notice is a notarial, the receipts are notarial, and they're standardized according, specified by law, really specifically to transparency modalities, chapter 1, which is mirrored in the Convention 108 plus and also in the GDPR. And so we're, line by line implementing the legal requirements technically. And to that, I've been working with a team of people, some in Canada and around the world actually, and a couple of them are online, which is great, so I can introduce some of them. But Dr. Kate Tills actually is the Canadian Research Chair focused on children and youth on digital well-being, and Sharon Polsky, she's the President of the Privacy and Access Council of Canada. So they certify the national body for certifying data privacy officers, and she leads on data privacy, the Canadian Privacy Framework. And then Mr. Tim Reiniger, he's out of Virginia, but he's the expert in cyber and remote notary and expert in digital identity law. He's had a lot of sway in making cyber notaries happen in the US. Sal D'Agostino, he's expert in physical access and security, and he's piloting a controller notice registry for video and physical spaces. So what we're proposing here works in all contexts, any legal justification and for physical and digital spaces. And then Paul Knowles, he's expert in dynamic data control, harmonization, across data ecosystems. And I think, I can show these guys here. Let's see. Yeah, so I'll call on, when I call on you guys can put your video on, speak, I guess, or if you guys want to put your video on, now's a good time. So, Tim, Paul? Oh, cool.
Morning from here.
So if you guys speak, can we hear you? So,
Test.
Yep.
No.
So I would have to turn my audio on for you guys. No, you should be coming out here.
Can you hear me, Mark or Paul or anybody?
Yeah, we can hear you, Sam.
See if there's
Okay,
a
thank you.
volume. It's all right. So no audio, guys, at the moment. All right. Well, we'll see if we can get some audio going in a second. Let's see. I could try. If we put audio on my device, it'll just blow up the speakers. So I'm not going to do that. But I might just mute that and try audio on mine in a minute when we get to you guys. Okay. So I'll channel a bit of you. So introducing digital privacy versus analog privacy. So right now, analog privacy, we just pretty much look at, currently we, experience analog data protection rules and notices while services enjoy digital control and access to our micro records and data. Implementation of privacy is not reciprocal and proportionate in context, so in a digital service, you might take 30 days to actually access your data or block processing. So analog privacy only requires like clear and plain language for a privacy notice to sign. So you'd have a purpose and maybe if you're lucky a phone number, you'd have to call out of context. And changes to privacy is not logged. Privacy policies are really for an I agree contract framework, so they're implementing a contract and don't actually implement privacy laws or rights according to where you are. So it's a fake, it's not actually even, I think, a contract. And the privacy policy information can change at any time. There's no log of it, and nobody can police it. So you actually don't know if the purpose you signed up for is still the purpose your data is being used for. So alternatively, with digital privacy transparency, records or processing activities are required every time your data is processed. But in our framework, it's required for any notice, notification, or disclosure. So that's where we look at really keeping the integrity of the services. So, and it's provided in a manner that enables people to see when their data is processed for a purpose, so that people can then start to trust processing their data. That's the fundamental component there, for what we talk about when we say trust. So there's a basic technical architecture that's pretty standard for digital privacy that we're looking at, and really a controller notice credential. So a controller notice credential is free. All the controllers are required to have one. It's an ISO standard. It's actually an open ISO standard. Any controller can make their own credential and link it to any notice or sign, and it would now have at least the information that passed the transparency scheme that we would have, and they could be held accountable. So that's the basic sort of approach. When you engage with this controller who has a credential, you can generate a receipt from that credential while reading the notice, and that predicts a proof of notice, which replaces the I agree checkbox or button. That can go into your wallet or into your browser, some sort of receipt storage, and the idea is that in your wallet or browser is where the consent button lies, not on the service, so that you can direct consent out at services. You would basically take the receipt, maybe fill in a consent form, add some more receipts to it, and send it off as a token back to the service provider. Without logging in, they don't need to know who you are. We're actually using the controller's ID or identity to pass verified claims where the individual could be anonymous or synonymous. So, but not by the service provider. So taking away the dependency on service providers. They actually call themselves relying parties, which is quite funny because the Digital Market Act calls them gatekeepers. So if you use the word relying party, you're automatically a gatekeeper, and you have a lot of responsibilities. And one of them is you're not allowed to use dark patterns, and I agree, it's a dark pattern. So effectively all these digital identity systems and all the age assurance out there right now is currently not compliant with the Digital Market Act. And so the transparency assessment scheme we have makes that automatically viewable. And so we're looking at a transparency index for regulators to enable and assist regulators to be able to use this and to process these with the evidence of these notice records much faster rates at a much larger scale, which we think is the way to move forward change in the market at pace. So that's what that's why I'm glad you're here. That's what we're really advocating for. So, I'm gonna put my notes up here so I can see where. Saying anything? Oh, so you guys say you can hear each other, but we just can't hear you in the room. All right, that's good. Thanks, Gillette. Okay, so how this open registrar or controller notary credential program would work is that a data privacy officer would get certified in digital privacy, and then they would enroll the controller to receive a notary credential that would enable this the DPO to actually act as a notary for their business or their service for that scope, so they could physically validate someone and also verify them in person, give that assertion with a notary stamp, and now you have that notarized verified credential in your wallet that you can assert a claim with. So it could be your school that's doing that as well. And then if you want a higher level of assurance to actually know that this is the actual person, at the point of presentation, you can go through the notary to the DPO and validate real time, is this the person? And that's basically how we are saying 100% accuracy can happen. The notary themselves, the registrar themselves monitors the data privacy officers, so the controllers for changes to their legal status, changes to so it's great. Yeah, so when they speak online, we can't hear them, but they can hear each other.
Yeah, volume is turned down.
Volume. Nice.
Sure.
So if they speak on the Zoom,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Mark,
Yeah,
can you hear
that-
us?
there you go.
Excellent. Thank you.
No worries.
Perfect.
It's the equivalent of, did you plug the computer in?
Happens to the best of us.
Great. So I'm talking about, what we're working on with, Tim Reiniger is, internationally looking at notary and involved in notary, legal development. So we're working on this program, and effectively the credential is bound to, an open icon, which is a digital privacy icon, and it's provisioned to the DPO as a, part of the credential. So that icon like this would be placed here, and the digital privacy layer automatically brings up the credential, who it is. So you can contact them, access your right to get a receipt in context using the overlay from the controller's credential, which is effectively a controller record, but provisioned to them and they sign with that. So this is a digital privacy enabled architecture. It's not preserving, it's not enhancing. It's actually enabled by digital privacy, which is different than what you might expect. So this can be placed on the website or any privacy notice, statement, sign, or physical access point. So it can be placed anywhere with a QR code or an NFC chip, and people can interact with this directly. So that's pretty much the fundamentals. And this is all the way we envision this is through a transparency code of conduct, which we're intend to put in front of CINO later this year, which effectively just makes more operational Chapter 1 transparency modalities as the privacy policy that people can use and the service can use. So one privacy policy with a consent code of practice, which is really defined by industry and context. So the registrar would extend that code of conduct with a consent code of practice, effectively. So that's how it looks, and the way it's we use this for scope of disclosures, children, youth, and community based. So effectively, police or emergency services or some third party who needs access to this data, they have to break the glass of that scope, and that's done transparently or secretly to the regulator, if it can't be transparent. So that's effectively the entire framework. From there, it's a double blind or zero knowledge proof based flow, where the person goes, reads a notice, they click agree, they get a receipt for that, which is a proof of that knowledge and notice, and then they take that receipt and they send it back, maybe with a claim, maybe not, in order to access the service. So they're not giving up their digital identity or their information to access privacy online, which pretty much takes away the point of doing it in the first place. So this is sort of what a two-factor notice would look like, or can look like, with a higher quality of proof of knowledge. So, privacy statement, what to expect. Did you read that? Did you know what the risks are? Did you read that? Yes. Then, put in the name of the controller or give us one of the risks you're about to have. Okay, we'll give you a receipt because you know enough to be proven that. So now you can actually prove enough knowledge to consent online, and that record and receipt means you don't actually have to read more notices again, and you don't have to have this notice all the time, every time you go to a session, because you are able to keep your own record of that in your wallet or browser. Even though a cookie does that, they still give you the banner every time. So it's a dark pattern, and they call it consent fatigue, but it's actually permission fatigue from IAB. So it's a dark pattern, but everybody, even that's consent fatigue. How do you solve that? Well, consent's natural. You just don't get in the way of it, and you don't have any fatigue. But I'm a sociologist by my background, so slightly different. So the higher assurance level, so now when we do the notary ledger and credential registry, it implements a much more robust levels of transparency assurance, not NIST federated assurance, but we're talking about transparency assurance, which is co-regulated. And effectively, it's not a relying party in this framework, it's a PI controller. But the controller provides the receipts, and then they want age assurance, so the individual can then send back a validated or notarized claim, or multiple claims. Like I can just make one from my, from a utility provider. I can make one from a bank. I can put all these claims together and have a really much higher levels of assurance than you could possibly get um, otherwise. And I don't have to give away my identity or digital identity information. It can be, the opposite of KYC, sort of know your business. The great thing about this being a standard and the law is that in the client or the wallet, you can just automatically make controller credentials, and you can just automatically use them. You can send them over to a controller, and you can measure how long it takes for them to answer a privacy request, and you can post that. So you can start just generating statistics on how dynamic a controller service is to make a much more competitive marketplace that's privacy compliant. And the idea here is that this is completely safe for children, and they're not known online, and the scope of disclosure is for the child, is for the parent, or the school, or community level. If you want to go beyond that, or if they want to go across the internet, that would be transparent, and their parents would see their data being processed real time, so they would know how much data disclosure is going on, because the source of data is controlled through the consent token or linked to the consent token. So basically, PI controller needs to know, I don't know how old you are. You can say, well, my age is actually over here at the bank. Do you want to go see it at the bank? So you don't actually have to present that. This way you can actually just, so that's there's many ways in which you can scale from there. So this basically solves all of these problems. It's compliant with Article 14, Chapter 1. It's a record of processing. There's log files, and it gets secure. Like it says that in the law that you need to, for international data transfers, there should be a log or a record that should be privy to the data protection authority that in that jurisdiction. So it's much more dynamic for data authorities. And then I jumped really far ahead, but Sal, if you're there, I was going to say, like we talk about the surveillance trust controller registry program that you're setting up in the US.
Yeah, happily. Folks hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So one of the advantages in the space where I work is that people don't have a problem in the security world saying that they do surveillance, which actually gives us a big leg up, because at least we can talk about transparency on purpose. So what we put in place is basically taking the same transparency performance scheme from Cantara, where I'm the chair of the work group and been working with Mark for years. And also the fact that our mutual backgrounds cover this whole idea of public surveillance using CCTV. I've spent most of my professional career, literally 40 years, doing surveillance, and I've been trying to do it properly. And so this is just sort of takes that experience and uses the scheme that we have and the framework that we have. And then, of course, the result is something which is a sort of standards-based way of providing transparency for the industry. One of the things about the security industry, or when people are creating physical access control system, is that, unfortunately, what they actually do is there may be a database somewhere. Let's say in a company, you've got a human resources database when you join the company. When the physical access system or the surveillance system is put in place, they actually replicate the entire database and distribute it almost every door in the building. So, in fact, there's a massive explosion of personally identifiable information throughout an enterprise, which many times people are not completely aware of. So the idea is to start with what we call WHISPER, which is white hat identity, security, surveillance, privacy, risk. And it's in order to be able to issue the notice in the first place for a surveillance controller or security controller, they have to have an understanding of the risk of their system. And that risk initially needs to be to look at the security of it. And we spend and actually run programs for the industry to help them do security properly. And can assess whether or not the networks are secure, their connections are secure. so that's like a starting point. And that's an easy entry point for an industry. So like, oh, you're in the security business. Do you actually doing security, or is this just security theater? And in fact, in many cases, this latter, even though it, it's not something that is widely acknowledged, which is also why a sort of white hat approach here might be helpful, because this industry needs help. Um, so the idea would be that once you've gone through this risk assessment, then you could actually be in the position to issue a notice. Because the notices Mark was talking about earlier, where you've got a controller and the controller issues a notice, the controller has an understanding of their risk in order to be able to present it to a data subject. So if in fact we've gone through this whisper risk assessment and they're capable of having an understanding and they can get a controller credential, then we can get to the point where we create a listing of those, and this information can be publicly accessible. That meets the first criteria in the transparency performance scheme, and the fact that you could get a notice before you're under surveillance, right? So, and again, in physical space, that usually take, you go through a door, no one's telling you, has ever told you about how that data is being used when you go through the door. So idea being then that if you had a listing, which effectively is a registry, and you had a registrar for an industry that not only determined whether or not they met the requirements of the transparency performance scheme, but they also adhered to a code of conduct and practice for the industry, then that can also be combined in that listing and registry, and be something to just sort of generally improve the trust and security systems. The result of this is actually a series of notices. And the cool thing about it is and it's the same issue that you run into online, is everybody's trying to figure out who you are without ever telling you who they are. And so really early on, we talked about this as privacy broadcasting, but it could be trust broadcasting. But it basically creates the access point, tells you about what you're going to access before you actually access the physical space. And as an example, if you were enrolled in a system and you went through the process of obtaining a receipt and capturing a record, basically you're capturing the state of a relationship about physical access to a space. And so and at that point, you would have an understanding about whether or not, in order for you to go from your car to your office without ever having to take your phone out of your pocket, touch an elevator button, you would be aware of that before that kind of tracking started, which those systems do exist in this world. And this industry has got surveillance cameras with all sorts of analytics in them. They can do emotion, they can do age. There's all sorts of things that this technology can do. And it's an industry which loves its buzzy stuff. So they'll adopt technology just because it's cool without understanding any of this. So it's really critical that people have an understanding of the risk that they enter into the space. And then once that's done, basically, and you've established the state of that relationship, the receipt that you had could be used to see if anything's changed, right? And so, if you have an understanding and nothing's changed, you're going to continue to have that understanding. If you have an understanding and something's changed, you can say, hey, wait a minute, what's changed? Let's reestablish the state of our relationship. Okay, fine, new receipt, added to the record, which updates the state, and then you proceed from there. And then in the future, that remains the same. That's fine. If that changes, then you can determine whether or not you want to continue this. It's something that, because of my relationship, I'm working with many of the reader vendors in the world to begin to implement this sort of, not only reading your credential, letting you into the door, but the control, the card reader itself actually telling you whether these things that I've just described. And the result is that it combines both ISO cybersecurity framework and the ISO privacy framework. It also adheres to NIST frameworks. It also adheres to all the other conventions we talked about. Thank you very much for your time, and everybody. Really happy to be here.
Thanks, Sal. That has been really amazing. You're great. I think
shocked. I think people will be shocked what consented video surveillance looked like. I mean, originally the research we did, we advocated. I did my MSc here. Then that was about consented surveillance, and then that actually went into the CCTV code of practice, where the only place you've ever seen is consented surveillance is in the CCTV code of practice. So besides this, all of this really came out of this work in research in the industry. So.
Yeah, it's great that you called it consented surveillance, Mark. I should have done that. That is how we refer to it, even though that times that kind of can explode people's heads. But it actually is the case, and that's also by what we've been working on is the protocol access control here, which we call auth. So as opposed to auth N, authentication, and then auth Z, authorization. What we're saying is there should be auth C, and so it should be the authorization from consent, right? So one of the things that I've learned is like a really easy red flag when it comes to consent. Is if someone says you consent to something, it's not consent. Consent comes from the individual, and the use of my personal information for controlling access also needs to come from me. So consented surveillance is the authorization from consent, and that is the human concentric protocol that we've been working in parallel with it, along with everything else we're talking about here. Thanks again.
Yeah. Thanks, Al. Tim, did you want to before we follow through there, say a couple of words about Notary, the Notary work that we're doing?
Yeah, I just want to let the audience know that after looking at all these slides and all that, it really, from a legal perspective, boils down to a few things. And Mark, I credit you for your insight on this, but to take this new concept, this challenge of consent management, keeping it human-centric, our immediate issues today of age verification with children, but to our historical legal precedents. And the notaries go back to, in our modern form, go back to the medieval 12th, 13th century. And it's been a brilliant aspect of our legal system, and it has been a proven success since the 12th, 13th century. So I think your insight is, why not apply them to this? And there's a whole governance structure in place. The notaries have accountability legally and so forth. And there is a long history of the legal proof that they provide. So the concept simply is to fix. It's a legal method for fixing rights and liability risk at points, and establishing legal relationships at a fixed point. This was probably most brilliantly applied to by the law merchant to negotiable instruments, and it continues to this day. And I think, Mark, you, in effect, really what you're saying is your insight has been that a consent receipt can be treated like a negotiable instrument, the way it can be handed under this process, making it scalable and enabling it to be used without having constant proof of identity and, as we call it, privacy protecting way. So really, all of these slides, we could come up with slides like this to describe the processes going back to the 13th century for the banking system, letters of credit, bills of exchange, promissory notes, going from one country to another, with protest forms and notices of dishonor and presentment and all that. But all of that was to fix legal relations. And with all these laws, at the end of the day, the controllers need certainty with respect to their liability risk and so forth. So this is a brilliant for that.
Thank you, Jim. That's super insightful. And it reminds me that the receipt actually goes back to the oldest form of found human writing. So it predates like clay tablet that was found on 3500 BC as a form of trust, because I guess they're taking food down waterways, and so it's eating all the food. So someone said, well, look, here's the thing they're sending. send it to this guy so I can trust it. So this receipt is pretty much the oldest tool of the human. And what's amazing is if we get to that secure infrastructure where data can be trusted and people can see it transparently, it opens up an entire new world of opportunities. So like to introduce Paul. Paul, are you there?
I am indeed. Hi everyone. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's been fun working with Mark on the privacy framework for a dynamic data economy, and my focus has really been on more of a data centric view as we've been kind of modeling this out, and that's really enabled some really interesting thinking around access-based control in the future of where we're going. And I just wanted to point you to that the model down bottom right there. With a data-centric view, you can really categorize data into objects, events, concepts, and actions, and you'll see some of the cross correlations between those domains are words that are very common in data processing. So provenance at the top there is objects and events, governance between actions and concepts, the mechanics of actions and events, and then the semantics of objects and concepts. So I won't go too much into that model. It was we're really proud of how that's come out. But then what you can think about there, if you kind of move to the left there, is in that the blue circle there is a consent token, and you can drill down into the consent token using that model from the right, so that you can give a different role-based access into different parts of the data packet that you're sending around a distributed data ecosystem. So, for instance, a data guardian could be protecting objects. A data notary could be, signing events. An auditor could be looking at actions into the system, and then you'd have a data warden that can be protecting, different concepts that are all bound into the consent token. So, and really, the real killer app here is that it enables dynamic data flows at scale. So what I mean by that is, if you have introduced sort of these consent tokens, as Mark has, it just provides a novel mechanism to ensure that data flows adhere to both local and international data protection regulations. You can be exchanging data across jurisdictions much simpler with a kind of this more sort of data-centric modeling approach that you're saying here. And one of the major advantages that this allows is if you it allows you to put the security around the data that you're sending around the system, rather than necessarily the node-centric designs that we've seen in the kind of the legacy internet as we're kind of describing it now, which just leads to data silos and all these security breaches and all that sort of stuff. And really, in the world we're going to, which is going to be very AI driven, we're looking at a system which is where data can flow easily, where people can request access to data, and the consent is always legally solid, and it's in the control of the people that should have control of their consent. And I really liked what Sal said, that consent is consent comes from, whereas permissions is permissions to something, and that's really resonating in my head. I really like that, Sal. So thanks for putting that out there. Yeah, so that's kind of all I had to say on that, Mark. Really, that just the system that we're talking about here can enable dynamic data flows and dynamic access into really granular, nuanced pieces of data, which allows people to have the right level of access to perform their notarial functions or their security functions without getting into these dangerous security breaches that we've seen over over the past 30 years, you know. So
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that's brilliant. The whole dynamic data opportunity, you would never really even get to that because we're talking about security all the time. So that, I mean, there's this system, which is showing you the community centric, really authentic Canadian quality consent. That's what we like to say. But it closes those gaps. People have their own records and receipts. That means they can have their own intelligence, their own private AI, their own clean data, which can stop all these problems, you know. So when you use a generative AI system, you get a receipt. You can then query that system for who's actually using my data, how many times it's been used. You can hold it accountable. But ultimately, we know that ethically, these LLMs being used for scrape data without consent. So they're not compliant. They're all biased. They have all these problems. But this enables a data trust model where you can have a large public, large-scale model that solves that problem. So the icon provides signaling, so people don't have to read notices unless the things have changed. Then they get a notification. So it can address this fatigue. Consent can be withdrawn, you know, for context from multiple services at once, which is true consent. Yeah, so there's a lot there. Fundamentally, I think we're out of time. We got right down the wire. We're starting an age assurance registrar working group at Cantera, where we're going to be bringing together. We're going to do a registrars program. We're looking to work with the Council of Europe and the OECD to put the transparency code of practice there and just enable, you know, age assurance to scale your parental verification, you know, to the market. So we'd like to see you guys become a registrar or in an industry association, you know, under the guidance of the regulator. So in that regard, the consent code of practice and that code of practice would have to be approved by a regulator in order for it to actually be usable in a system. That's part of the assurance program out of Cantera. So that's also the way it's been set up, I believe. Now the ICO actually has a mechanism where you can put a code of practice. Yeah. Codes. Code of conduct. Yeah, so it's transparency code of conduct, which is the GDPR, and then it's the code of consent practice for children. Design code of practice is already there, and Kate, we already work with that, and we've done a lot of input into that. So we think we can implement that really easily using these icons for children. You know, so that's like that. Yeah, so it's just the framework and the infrastructure for the programs that you go to working on them. But we'd really like to, you know, see if we could start that program in September moving forward. So that's the idea. And yeah, so if you want to get involved that way, or if anybody wants a whisper report, you know, we'd like to whisper report on regulators, but we won't tell anybody, you know. That's it. So thanks a lot. If you have any questions, thanks guys for coming in and taking the time. Yeah.
You're still there.
You guys are there? Okay. Nobody's got any questions, but let's see if we got any thing in the chat, I guess. Or some chats. I'll check down here. That's it. Some people were hanging around for Q&A, but they've gone. Does anybody have a question from online? Nope. All right. Thanks a lot.